Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Many of you are joining us from Asia today, so it's a pleasure to welcome this diversity. And I would like to introduce my partner in crime this morning, Svetlana, who is going to help us today, for example, launching the polls. We also, a whole team, I would like to thank IMD's communication department with Daniele and Lorik and all the production team and the communication teams that are behind. So thank you very much for joining. It's a great honor to have you at IMD today. And we're going to talk about agility, and I'm going to start sharing my visual support with you. And so in the context a little bit particular of implementing agile methods, what's on the agenda today? I want to, I'm sure there's really many of you have registered. I think more than 700 of you have registered. So obviously it's a topic that is driving traction. So before I go forward, I hope you are comfortably seated, and I would like to share with you the view of where we sit at IMD in Lausanne. If you've never been on campus, I hope you will one day. You can see across the lake, the French Alps and the little town of Evian, where the famous water is coming from. So this is a picture that was taken 3 weeks ago, earlier this spring. So, and it gives you a little bit of the context and flavor of our campus. So there was a survey in McKinsey last July of global CEOs, and in their top 3 priorities, they placed the need to roll out agile ways of working and the need for more adaptability, of course, in the context of the pandemic, but also in the context of their digital transformation. So we're going to look very briefly at why agile methods have become so popular. And I don't know, I'm going to do a poll in a second to see how familiar you are already with all these concepts. So, but I suspect a little bit of diversity. So I will try to bring you up to speed with what are 3 agile methods that are probably the most important going on and implemented right now. But the core of the presentation and our exchange will be about how can you implement agile methods outside and on a bigger scale than a few isolated pilots to drive greater organizational agility. Okay, so if you have any question, we're going to have time at the end for Q&As, but I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible with the polls, with the chat moments. So please be engaged, you know, so it's really a great opportunity for you to pause and learn from each other, not just from me, of course. So Svetlana is going to launch the first poll. And there are 2 questions to that. One is to know a little bit about your background. And the second one is to know about your familiarity with agile methods. So Svetlana, I think that should be it. If you want to show us the results now. So it's good. We have a diversity of profiles, you know, and quite a few. The leading group is part of a top executive team. So, and quite a good mix also about familiarity with what agile methods are and their potential, but also the pitfalls, because we're going to look a lot about the pitfalls and how you can, you know, anticipate those and navigate them better. So I'm going to come back to this poll and ask you a few questions, in particular to those of you who have said, yes, we are rolling out agile methods currently. But now that I know a little bit about your diversity, let me introduce a little bit more about myself. So at IMD, I'm a professor of strategy and organizational innovation. which means that I direct certain open programs, like I co-direct digital execution, and certain customer corporate client relationships in the custom side. And I've had 3 careers. One was in luxury goods. My second one was at Accenture in the strategy department in London. And consultants like to define themselves with an industry expertise and a functional expertise. So I would say my industry expertise is really in the field of luxury goods, where I do a lot of work with many companies on innovation in response to disruption. And I've created a program, the Reinventing Luxury Lab, which runs once a year here at IMD, and I write a column on this topic in Forbes. So you're welcome to check that out. On the functional basis, I'm really interested in how companies can adapt and renew their competitive advantage over time. I think that's what's driving my interest in research. So what I'm going to do briefly is to give you the genesis of my research that's culminating in the book that is going to be published in less than 2 weeks now, Resetting Management. And what was driving my my interest was, companies face a lot of disruption and uncertainty at the moment. At IMD, we do a biannual survey which asks executives to assess to what extent they think their company and their industry will be disrupted by digital transformation. And we call that the digital vortex. And in this vortex, companies can be drawn to the center, industry boundaries collide, new entrants come in unexpectedly with new business models. So there's a lot of fast change and uncertainty around with digital transformation. It's not the only cause of high levels of uncertainties for companies. And then I had the realization that while some companies, in the left-hand side columns, have become the victim of that uncertainty, others have been adapting remarkably well over time. So my research question was how non-digital native companies or legacy businesses adapt to this high turbulence and high uncertainty. So I see some of you are noting about the high resolution. There's a problem with the resolution of the slides. I'm not very sure why this is happening, but we're going to try and fix it. So my colleagues on the organization side are going to try and fix it. Okay. So that question led my co-author Martin Kralik and I to undertake about 10 in-depth case studies across a whole spectrum of B2C and B2B organizations to try and find out, for example, this big agile movement, that was emerging on the back of the Agile Manifesto that certain companies were embracing. What were the potentials for companies to increase their agility? And what were the roles of digital transformation and agility transformation? How do they relate to one another? How can companies embrace or become more adaptive over time? Okay, so I think the peculiarity of the book is that we look at agility at 3 levels: the strategy part, the organizational part, and the leadership element. And we provide very much new tools, Canvas, diagnosis assessment tests, in order to help executives like you to grasp and understand what is agility and how to transform, because we spend a lot of time about navigating the challenges of transformation. So fundamentally, our conclusion with resetting management is that, this alignment, external alignment with the environment, and internal alignment via strategy with the organization are still extremely important for delivering higher performance. But what should company need to do to be fit for the more turbulent and uncertain environment? So if we have an uncertain environment, the likelihood is that we're going to need new ways of strategizing, new ways of organizing and working, new ways of leading. Okay, and in our research in resetting management, we really dive into what are the specificities and principles of strategic agility, organizational agility, and leadership agility. And it's really in this context of organizational agility that I'm going to talk about now with you on the role that agile methods play. So because some of you have not started to roll up, 45% in the survey, you said, we have not really rolled out agile in a large scale, I would like to bring you up to the same page, okay? And I would like to introduce briefly 3 key agile methods: Scrum, design thinking, and lean startup. So for Scrum, which is by far the most popular of all the agile methods, which emerged in particular in the software industry, I'm going to begin by showing you a short video from the Scrum Alliance.
Complex projects can lead to real headaches. Organizing the team, changes in scope, roles that aren't clear. But you can change that with Scrum, an agile framework. At its foundation, Scrum can be applied to any project or product development effort. Here's how it works. A product owner creates the product backlog, a prioritized wish list. During sprint planning, the team pulls a chunk from the top of that list and decides how to complete it. The team has a set time frame, the sprint, to complete their work. They meet in a daily scrum to keep the work moving forward. Along the way, the Scrum Master keeps the team focused. At the end of the sprint, the work should be potentially shippable. The team conducts a sprint review on the product and a retrospective on the process. Then, they choose the next chunk of the backlog, and the cycle repeats. With Scrum, you can ensure the most valuable work has been completed by the time the project ends. Tackle your projects with Scrum.
Just a question. So what you saw in the video is detailing the processes, but also the roles in Scrum. So the purpose of Scrum is to break down complex projects or innovation projects into smaller chunks. And why does it enable companies to respond to uncertainty? It's because the members of the cross-functional teams or small teams that work to deliver a solution to the customers can reprioritize all the time based on the feedback they receive from those customers. So it's a customer-centric process that's iterative. You see that it starts by defining priorities, allocating the work within the cross-functional team. And I think the cross-functional team is very important here. There's going to be a retrospective to see if the solution is shippable to the customer, and a retrospective because learning from what we've just done to do better next time is going to be really important. Okay, so it's about breaking down those complex projects into smaller chunks, and depending on what the customers say, we can reprioritize certain things. So it's not set in stone. That's where adaptability also comes from. And you've probably noticed in the interview that there are 2 key roles here. One, in the team, someone is in charge of following that the team does the process of Scrum well. And in particular, this is important because you also notice that there is a sprint planning. So usually companies will adapt that to their circumstances, but traditionally it's about 10 days. Within 10 days, we need to deliver what we have promised to the customer. So that needs to be really, really speed and efficient. So the Scrum Master is really defining and paying attention to how people work in the team. The product owner, on the other hand, is focusing on what the team is doing and how it meets the expectation and the changing expectation of the customer. So basically, that's how Scrum works. And as I said, emerged first in the software environment, but now is used by companies for revisiting all their processes, for example, in finance, in HR, in marketing. So the scope and why we're talking together today, it's because this has gone way beyond the IT department, this agile movement, this Scrum movement. So that's why it's important to know exactly what it entails. So 55% of you in the survey mentioned that you have rolled out agile methods in your organization. So let me ask you which agile methods you've rolled out particularly. So please write down in your chat. And you could write also where you launched them and for what purpose. So thanks, Daniel. You're using Scrum for software development, design thinking. Some of you Scrum, the big majority, DevOps, which is really about a particular version of Scrum for software development, design thinking, a lot of Scrum again. Scrum is by far for you the majority of the projects you're leading, followed by design thinking. Someone says lean here. So I'm going to explain a little bit more what about lean startup means. Not to mix up with Lean Six Sigma. Okay, thank you for these answers. So a diversity of methodologies, but also a large majority of Scrum-based. And the purpose is quite diverse. Some of you use it in HR, some of you use it in product development, some use it in software development. So the goal here is to innovate faster by responding to unexpected and changing customer needs, because we take the customer's feedback regularly in the Scrum process. I think if I wanted to summarize, this is what it is about. The second really popular agile method is lean startup. Okay, so this was invented by, coined by Eric Ries in his book already 10 years ago, believe it or not. And I think the two, it's also a customer-centric type of approach for innovating. It's really focused on innovation. And why is it called lean startup? An entrepreneur, particularly in a startup, doesn't have a lot of money. And when they want to launch a business idea, they want to do it with more accuracy to minimize the risk of failure. Usually what big companies do is that they're going to come up with all sorts of fancy innovations. And when they reach the market, at the end, the project flops because no one wants it. So rather than asking, can we do something? The question is, should we be doing something? And here you go and collect data from the customer to test a business idea hypothesis. So the two main things that have remained famous about lean startup is the minimum viable product. So rather than delivering a perfect solution that no one wants, you're going to deliver something that's good enough to get customer feedback quickly. And if they like it, if you get the feedback, you can adapt, iterate, go back to the customer and improve until you have a business idea. The second big idea about the lean startup is this concept of, and it's a really important for culture and leadership, is accepting failure, that the failure is part of success. So testing fast, failing fast, but what everyone forgets is succeed faster, is also a core mindset element and shift from traditional management to agility management with the lean startup methodology. Design thinking is also a customer-centric process, but the big difference with lean startup is that you have no hypothesis about what it is your customers want. So it's a complete deep dive exploratory process to discover what customers really need. So it's based on 3 phases. The first one is about the discovery. The second one is about coming up with ideas. The third one is about testing via prototypes. And these prototypes are not minimum viable products. They are very serious prototypes. But I think what's important is also the cross-functionality of talents here and teams. You know, you will need to observe customers in their real life, in their homes, in hospitals, in the banks, and because you're going to discover all sorts of things that you never imagined were the pain points of those customers. So once you figure out what are the real pain points, you start discovering new business ideas to mitigate those purposes, and your job starts there with design thinking. Okay, so you're going to design a solution around unmet customer pain points that you couldn't distinguish or know of when you started that process. So perhaps contrary to lean startup or to Scrum, design thinking is not about speed. You know, it's usually quite a lengthy process of you're going to get a lot of data based on real customer life observation. So you can't really rush that type of process. But you're right, Xavier Yves, it's also a lot about innovation. Okay? So let me ask you, do you have any questions at this time before I go forward? Good question, Ioannis. Do we need to use multiple methods? I think it depends on what you do, okay? But companies, a little bit like General Electric, launched Agile, launched Scrum in the digital divisions, and Lean Startup that they call Fast Work in the industrial divisions. Suddenly people realized that these Agile methods are the 2 sides of the same coin. Suddenly people were lost because the Scrum people didn't understand the Lean Startup ways of working and vice versa. So I think it's a good idea if you decide to roll out Agile to equip your talents with a toolbox of different Agile methods. But what's really important is that they understand when to use what, because they do not play necessarily the same purpose. You know, with Lean Startup, you already have an idea that you want to experiment further. If you don't have a business idea, then maybe it's useful to use the design thinking methodology. Okay, so you really need to understand when these things fit where, and I'm going to talk about that more. Yeah, so how do you manage the expectation with the MVPs? Well, I think it's going to go little by little. You know, with software, when it's a software components, which is part of your new product design or innovation, you can launch to groups A or group B. They don't see necessarily the same thing. You can also choose to test with very loyal customers. You know, So it requires both an external education. So in industrial sectors, for example, it's an education of your customers, and it requires inside an education of your employees about how you get comfortable with using MVPs. Yeah, so I think also you're asking, is Scrum just about project management? And I think that's a very interesting question, because I think originally the Agile Manifesto that comes behind Scrum in particular was just much more than continuous improvement. It was really about empowering employees to innovate. So I guess here every company will need to calibrate what they do with Scrum. Can it be more than project management? But if you ask a lot of companies that I talk to, like the ING senior management, for example, they say there's nothing stops you from using Scrum to accelerate radical innovation solutions. Okay? Yeah, the difference between doing Agile and being Agile, I'm going to come up to later on. Okay? It's a good question and very, very important. Yeah, thank you for signaling the Stacy metrics to determine what to use and when. That's a very good idea. And yeah, I've seen Agile implemented in all sorts of industries. Yeah. Very good. So let me, and by the way, if I don't have time to handle all your questions, because I think you are 500 on the line, so I'm sorry I can't cope and respond to all the questions, but please feel free to reach out after this webinar and webcast, and either on LinkedIn or by email at IND, okay? Or find the answers in resetting management probably as well. So my question to you is, have you ever wondered why they're called agile methods? And this is one where I want to be really, really clear, okay? So in my research, I've discovered that legacy businesses and non-digital native tend to be favoring the status quo. They are risk averse. They continuously invest in the core business, not enough in the future businesses. So they're very driven by stability. They also have a lot of bureaucratic processes, reporting rules, hierarchical layers that make them a little bit inward looking. And that's what I call the complexity of these large organizations, okay? By contrast, digital natives, or startups even, are much nimbler, experimental, and fast, and also simpler. The ways of working, the structure, the organizations are simpler. So we call agile methods agile. I would argue that because they have some characteristics, the three methods, with the exception of speed for design thinking, but it's about empowered, small cross-functional teams that are empowered to experiment around the customer. So the customer centricity element is very important here, okay? And it's about taking in the uncertainty of the external world by involving the customer to increase the accuracy of the go-to-market and the innovation projects. That's where I would say nimble is coming from these three agile methods. But it's also about simplification. You want to reduce the wastes, what's unnecessary, where are the redundant processes or resources that we use. And by extension, because it's cross-functional, you will have much more collaboration, You're aiming for fewer silos when you innovate. And it's also about flattening the hierarchy. So simplification in the way we work. So that's where I would say the word agile method comes from. So I wanted to be clear about this. So for big companies that are rolling out agile methods in a big way at the moment, and I'm going to talk and give you some examples in 5 minutes, it's about becoming nimbler and becoming simpler and learning from the digital natives, learning from the startup world, how to do that. I think that's been really the driver. So Svetlana is going to launch now another poll. And because if there are some great examples of success, there are also a lot of examples of challenges. So let me ask you, where are you now? How satisfied are you with the rollout of agile methods in your organization or your business? So Svetlana, perhaps we could show the results now. Neutral. So sitting on the fence, you know, and it's okay, but it could do better, probably. That's what it means. So the largest group is neutral, and only 30% of you are actually satisfied. So you see, that's where we're all here today. That's where I wrote a book. It's because there are a lot of challenges. And I'm going to give you now 3 common pitfalls that companies that use or agile methods in a large scale in order to transform the organization for more agility, where are they usually stumbling? Okay, so we're going to learn from the case studies that I conducted in this for this book project. What the research shows, so for example, I did work with General Electric, and in their gas turbine division, they were able, for the development of new gas turbines, to slash the development of a project from 5 to 2 years in half the costs. That's an example. There was a Forrester study in 2019 showing that the good use of design thinking can create return on investment of between 71 and 100%. So really big increases there. There were studies showing that compared to waterfall innovation management, Scrum agile management can actually increase or decrease the failure rate by 3 times. Okay, so there are serious, although I would say still not large-scale quantitative studies, in my view, proving the benefits of agile. But we're working on that. You know, the academic world is working on that. There are also a lot of evidence that agile methods companies struggle to really get the benefits. So it's either neutral or problematic. So I'll let you discover those recent statistics. Okay, so the good question we want to ask is, so for organizational agility, how can we roll out agile methods more successfully? How can you make it work for you? And I think the first type of challenges that I've met in my research are that agile, if not properly implemented, can result in chaos. And if you talk to a lot of senior management, that's the main concern that they have. And why? It's because if you focus just on being nimble and simple, you're going to stumble. So what companies, large companies, legacy businesses need to think of is, first of all, creating a clear direction. So if you empower teams to innovate and explore, how can you at the same time deliver consistently on your strategy? If you're listed company, quarter after quarter, remunerate your shareholders. So from a leadership perspective, it's about really telling the story about why are we doing or using agile, what are the outcomes we expect, what happens if we fail, how do we create the trust, but how do you give the frames, the strategic boundaries within which your employees are going to be able to experiment. And not only that, you need to think about keeping people focused on performance. So how you define the rule of accountability is really important. And here the complication is that it's not about micromanaging people, because otherwise you're not going to create the trust for them to really experiment and innovate and to listen to the customer. So it's more about shifting to how you measure performance from input into outcome. And measuring the outcome is what's going to be really important in driving that accountability and the focus on performance. So while you need the nimbleness, you also need the stability. Second aspect, and some of you in the chat asked me about, this question about when do we know if we should use agile and what kind of form and where, is extremely important. Because it's easy to start thinking, oh, we're going to use agile because everyone is doing it at the moment. That's not the point. What you want is to adapt the right method for the right purpose. For example, with Scrum, if you can't break out a complex task into smaller modules, then you can't even start using Scrum. If there is no uncertainty about what the customer wants, like for example, why would you use Scrum to create a balance sheet or a profit and loss statement? It's regulated by law. You don't need to know or ask the customer what this is about. So the chances are in the finance function, you would use Scrum or agile methods much less, which doesn't mean that the finance people shouldn't have an agility mindset. They should. And we're going to look at this in a moment. Okay. The other thing is, so you can't force fit the same thing everywhere in your company. You will have to adapt. That's what I call structural differentiation. You might use Scrum here, you might do design thinking there, but not here, but not there. Okay, so you need a certain amount of sophistication or complexity for making those choices. The other element is there's the need for learning. So, if you work in fast pace, a problem that companies have usually is that they're not giving enough time to really learning, transferring the experience to other projects where some of the lessons could make other projects really, really successful and better. And to do, if you empower employees, but don't give them access to real data with transparency, they won't be really, really empowered. So this culture of data-centric transparency and continuous learning is extremely important. And I think these two characteristics is what we call in the book the complexity element. And it's the realization that suddenly some stability and some complexity for large companies can be really, really healthy. Okay, so where do companies stumble with the rollout of Agile is that they're not prepared to reconcile the competing demand between stability and nimbleness and between complexity and simplicity. So I would argue that if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to roll out these agile methods properly from an organizational design perspective. And you're not going to be as flexible as you want, because the flexibility comes from the ability to do both of these things, rather than just being either stable or complex or nimble and simple. legacy businesses are not startups, nor should they be startups. So they have to use the benefit of their scale and where they come from. So that's the first advice here. Then in the research, what companies frequently overlook is the challenges that are going to come from the way they scale those agile methods and how they introduce them in the organization. So I discovered 3 ways of rolling out agile methods. The first case, and I'm going to give you the example of Lego, is what we call with Martin in the book, the enclave. And it's where one particular division is going to use one agile method or several, like Lego in the digital solutions division is using multiple agile methods, but the rest of the organization is not using them. So on the back of their digital transformation, a few years ago, Lego launched this digital solutions division to create a digital engagement platform where they would collect feedback from the fan, make Lego available 24/7 to the customers, create a lot of new software applications embedded in the toys, and create all sorts of new customer journey for their customers. Okay. So they started to use different agile methods, and the benefit of rolling out, containing, if you like, the agile methods in one part of the company is that you can measure success and progress more rapidly, and you can actually also, bring people to speed really, really quickly in that particular division. The challenge, though, of this approach is how do you manage the interface with the non-agile parts? And that's what Lego discovered. And their approach to do that was to create every 8 weeks a one-day Scrum of Scrum between the people from the digital solutions division and those people from the other parts of the organization that might need to have a say in what is delivered digitally. So this is about bringing a dialogue via big Scrum boards, people talking about what's coming in the pipeline, non-agile parts starting to think about where, if there are the bottlenecks to delivering those innovations with speed, and if there are the bottlenecks, how can we work together to overcome those bottlenecks? Okay, so other companies, it's a quite frequent approach. Deutsche Telekom, for example, was using when we did the research agile methods in just the innovation division. Okay, so the mainstream part of the business was not using that. However, at some point, all these people have to collaborate. So here you need to think how you will bring this collaboration. And it's a cultural change. The second type of configuration that we saw was, particularly in a pharmaceutical company, was what we call the ad hoc approach. It's about letting people discover what forms of agility they need so that they can implement it better to the real needs that they have in their business. So this pharmaceutical company was realizing that there was a lot of uncertainty coming up its way, digital disruption, leaders were overstretched. So they launched a learning and development project where they asked 700 of their top management or top leaders to think about what kind of leadership style they would need in the future to future-proof the company. And this triggered a kind of avalanche movement where those leaders asked their teams to come up about new ways of working in the company. And all sorts of pockets of agile projects and agile innovation starting to roll over all across worldwide that company. Some of the projects or some of the innovation managed to be globally rolled out, but others were conducted in specific or countries or business divisions. So there were also unexpectedly silos that started to creep in, or people not having the same language, so misunderstanding. So that approach, on the one hand, was very successful because this company was able to bring, by simplifying the new drug application, was able to bring new drugs to their patients like almost 3 months earlier, or cutting down the compliance bureaucracy by 30%. Okay, but on the other hand, the big job for this pharmaceutical company was to really create the commonalities, the common framework, so that after all these experiments, you get everyone on the same boat. Okay, GE is an interesting case because they used the same approach, except that top down, they gave the lean startup framework as a tool and trained thousands of employees with lean startup. So everyone had the common language right away. And finally, you could also choose to go for a hub contained rollout of Agile, which is what Rabobank did for their digital transformation. And at the beginning, they didn't want to allocate, hundreds of people in Agile team. So what they did was to create a small hub at headquarters focused on simplifying the customer journey and drawing people from the main businesses to work for a few weeks on a particular project and go back to their main business line. So what was good about this approach is that it was building excitement about Agile. A lot of people got trained within the hub, and it created an excitement about this. However, what was difficult is that people didn't want to go back to the traditional management and ways of working. And the middle management, as the hub was becoming more and more successful, was reluctant to lend more and more resources. And because they were still in charge of evaluating the performance of their employees in the hub, and they had no ideas what they were doing there, it was getting really, really challenging. Okay, so Rabobank had to choose how to scale Agile even further to the whole organization, not just the retail bank, but now they're doing it in the wholesale bank and other divisions. Okay, so what you could see here is to think about what are the unintended challenges you're going to face when you roll out Agile methods in a big way and outside the IT department. So this will be my last pitfall, and it comes back to a point you made earlier, in fact, which is the difference between doing Agile and being Agile. Okay, so I told you that for companies, for non-legacy businesses, large companies that want to adapt to digital disruption and higher uncertainty and turbulence, the challenge is to move the cursor from being mostly stable and complex towards being nimble and simple as well. And what we discovered in the book is that there are 3 clusters of companies we worked with. The companies I just talked to are experimenting with Agile methods at scale and trying to resolve and become stable and nimble and complex and simple, more flexible in that way. We also found other companies that were perhaps and didn't need to be as nimble as simple. and didn't even use agile methods to yet become nimbler and simpler in function of what was needed in their industry, in their context. The luxury good company we studied, for example, had certainly a lot of cash. The level of outside disruption was not as important as you could say a pharmaceutical or a bank is facing. And the pressures to adapt quickly were not as high. But what's interesting is that neither this luxury company nor the leading cosmetic company Clarins used agile methods. So in the book, we explain very much how they designed their organization to be nimbler and simpler without using agile methods at all. And then we discovered a third cluster where actually the new type of organizations this company used are mind-blowingly new, radically new, a new species of organization. And if you think about the bank ING, you could not even think that this exists in a highly regulated sector. So the difference between ING and the Chinese hire in white appliances is that ING uses concepts from agile, whereas hire doesn't at all. But what's common across all these companies is that they try to balance clear direction and strategic vision with customer-centric experimentation. They try to balance discipline and accountability with empowerment. They try to balance to simplify the organization, but at the same time to pay attention to where cannot we be as simple? Where should we not be simplistic? They try to reduce the bureaucracy, flatten the hierarchy, but they also try to increase learning, the hyper-awareness, the information-based, database type of decision-making. So although they design in different ways and they calibrate agility to their needs, if you like, and the form of agility they need, they all follow those principles of agility. So that concludes what I wanted to tell you today. We have 5 more minutes for questions. So let's exchange a little bit more. So Vincent had a question. How important is it to harmonize the agile frameworks versus leaving teams the freedom to adapt agile methods to their needs? Yeah, it's a little bit the question that the point that I made earlier. You know, I think you're going to gain a lot of time if you build the toolbox about what are these different methods, what do they want to achieve, how do they work, so that people see the commonalities and not the differences, but they also know when to use when, what to use when. How is the hierarchy affecting the agility? Well, the more hierarchy you have, the more complex the organization is. So could be an obstacle. So then it's up to you to decide what's the right level of hierarchy. What I was telling you here is that the hierarchy will remain. How flat it becomes, it's a design choice you need to make. The challenge, the product of developing product in agile and transferring it to the main division. Yeah, so I think here the challenge is about rejecting not what was not invented here. So it's how you're going to bring the non-agile and agile part together early so that they collaborate. And usually the incentives, the rewards, the career progression will play a role in making people collaborate across agile and non-agile parts. Oh, real prototype versus MVP. So, for example, in the hospital environment, I'm aware of design thinking projects that were really about reconstituting the whole patient experience in a hospital. Okay, so and that require quite a degree of sophistication as a prototype compared to an MVP. Connecting agile with waterfall. This I'm not so familiar with, but what I've discovered in the research is that you can really well, I think it's going to be messy to do agile and waterfall anyway, but Lean Six Sigma is not incompatible with Lean Startup, in the sense that what GE does is accelerating the innovation process and its accuracy through Lean Startup. But once the prototype has been defined as the final product, then they implement their Lean Six Sigma or zero defect quality standards. You can't have a gas turbine or an aircraft engine which looks like a minimum viable product. You have to understand that as a stage in a faster development process, but once the final prototype is approved as the final design, then you want to improve and to deliver the zero defect quality. So the two are not incompatible. Functional leaders, that's a great question. I will leave it here, but thank you very much. That's a point we make in resetting management, is that I think that organizational agility and the future organization will see less and less distinction between business-like and function-like people, because we all in it together. In cross-functional teams, you need all sorts of talents. So you see certain functions even disappearing as departments. And this notion that functions are cost centers and divisions are profit makers, I think are going to really blur in the future. So let me leave you with my final takeaways today, right? So why did we write this book? Is to help you become a management resetter, the management resetter that your business needs. And this boils down to these 5 recommendations, and that summarizes a little bit the presentation that I did today. And of course, if you are interested in exploring, because this was really a tiny little part of what we touch on the book, you can now pre-reserve with a 20% discount on the Kogan page website, Resetting Management. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for joining, and we hope to welcome you for new or again at IMD very soon. And for now, stay safe.